everyone. Welcome to Global Connect, the World Mission event that broadens our vision for gospel-centered ministry while bringing us closer to our mission partners. This evening, our special guest is Andy Weatherley, live from Birmingham, England in the United Kingdom. Andy is a pastor of Grace Church, Dale Road in Southern Birmingham, a church he planted in 2007. Our partnership with Andy involves his role as a trainer and coach for Reformed UK church planters from the International Presbyterian Church, the Free Church of Scotland, and the Fellowship of Independent Evangelical Churches. Andy is a member of the training teams for the UK Partnership, City City Europe, and the London Project. He runs the Manchester Incubator, a 2-year training and coaching program for church planters that most recently has included our partners, Pete Evans and Mal Clark, who planted Trinity Church Manchester in 2020. Andy's married to Jo. Jo helps support UK church planter wives through her ministry with Pericleo. They have 2 children, daughter Fionn and son Josh. Plus they have a new family dog that they got just before the lockdown last year. Hi, Andy, it's so great to see you. Thanks so much for being with us tonight. I know you stayed up really late to be with us, and so we really, really appreciate that. It's always, like I said, it's always great to be with you. And just one thing before we get started, I'd like our viewers to know that we'll have a Q&A session after your presentation. So if anyone has a question for Andy, please type this in the chat window. Andy, Global Connect, welcome. Everyone needs a coach. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Sandy, and it is a real delight. I know it's fairly late for me here. It's already tomorrow, but it's a real delight to be with you guys and to partner with you in the way that you partner with us and the way that you are such an encouragement to me and to the ministries that we're involved in here. So it's a real delight to be with you. Yeah, I should just say, so as Sandy said, I'm speaking to you tonight from Birmingham, not Birmingham in Alabama, but Birmingham in the UK. Birmingham is about 2 hours from London, out of the UK. It's the second largest city in the UK, well over 2.5 million people in the metro area, around 4 million people in the region who are within an hour's commute of the city centre. It's kind of home of British manufacturing, blue collar city. They call it the city of 1,000 trades, home to Jaguar Land Rover, Aston Martin. 200 yards away from my house over here is the Cadbury chocolate factory, the inspiration for Willy Wonka and all that sort of thing. 200 yards in the other direction is an old factory unit that made bullets for all sorts of things, including some sent to the American Civil War. So I feel we're connected. Sandy sort of explained my involvement in church planting, and I'm currently still pastor of Grace Church we planted here 14 years ago, but also I have a role training and coaching church planters. A couple of years ago, I became an accredited coach with Church Multiplication Ministries based in Atlanta, and I'm actually coached by a Presbyterian minister in Atlanta. Maybe it's helpful for me to say what I'm not doing tonight. So I'm not training you to become a coach, and I'm not selling any coaching services, but I do hope through what we look at, I give you a vision for coaching. That's really my intention. So tonight I want to talk through 5 different things. I want to define gospel coaching. What is it? How does it work? I want to explain why I think gospel coaching is so vital. I want to explain what difference I think it makes. I want to tell you a little bit about what it looks like very briefly, and then we'll come round again to that final thing to everyone needs a coach and what that looks like. I think many people will have come across the term or idea of coaching in a professional environment. In recent years, it's become a very popular tool for personal development in the workplace. So if you've come across coaching, you'll probably be aware of it as an intentional conversation. The expertise of the coach is generally in asking great questions that draw out from the coachee the solutions to their professional or personal issue. The issue with that, of course, in terms of that approach to coaching, and if that's what we're talking about as coaching, I think it is essentially a humanistic framework. It's the idea that the answers lie inside you, and I as a coach am here to help draw them out of you, which seems that would have more to do with the message of well, I remember watching the movie with my kids, Kung Fu Panda. That's the message of Kung Fu Panda, isn't it? The answers lie inside you. Yeah, it has more to do with Kung Fu Panda than necessarily the gospel. So just to be clear, that definition of coaching is not what we're talking about. There's a distinction to gospel coaching, because the human heart is deceitful above all things. So the answers flow from life in Christ, not simply within me, and I need someone to draw the answers out of me. So let me try and define gospel coaching for us in a phrase. And with this, well, this is what we always say to folks who a new coachee. If I meet a new coachee for the first time, try and explain. This is our definition of coaching. Coaching is a regular, intentional, gospel conversation with focused discussion around the leader's relational, personal, missional, and spiritual life. Now, I'll come back to that. If you didn't get it, don't worry. I'll come back to it again. But a regular, intentional, gospel conversation, focused discussion around the leader's relational, personal, missional, and spiritual life. And some of the features of gospel coaching, if I outline them to you, first feature is it's regular, it's intentional, and it's focused. So we do prepare for it, and the coachee thinks about what they're going to need help with. It's intentional in that it's not allowed to drift. As a coach, the conversation is structured. I have a plan where I'm going. And as a coach, I'm regularly asking questions, but there's a significant purpose to those questions. And I don't just ask questions as a coach. So it's regular, intentional, focused. Secondly, it's a gospel conversation. It's not simply skill or knowledge driven, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And thirdly, it's broad ranging. So one session we might be looking at the tension that a church planter is experiencing in their marriage. Next time it's how they're developing leaders. The next time it's focusing on managing a conflict in church life or some other leadership challenge. It's diverse in terms of the conversations and the things that we're talking through. And fourthly, and I think this is easy to overlook, it's highly relational. So it depends on a close personal relationship where the coachee trusts me as a coach, and there's an openness. There's no fear that confession will be met immediately with condemnation. I think that's important. It's no exaggeration that your perception of what church planters in the UK might look like is probably correct. These guys are very resilient, hardworking, but often very emotionally retentive. And it's no small thing to, in a relationship with coach and coachee, if we're laughing and crying together, as we talk with depth, as we pray together, and the warmth, it flows from a love, a sense that we're going to talk, we're going to commune with God about the issues that are raised as we talk through. So it flows out of relationship with one another, but also connected to Christ and communing with God. So that's the first thing. So we kind of begin to introduce the idea of what gospel coaching is, what I'm talking about. Secondly, I want to explain why I think gospel coaching is so vital. And I don't want to say, listen, coaching is the thing. Okay, this is the program you must have in your life. I'm not a snake oil salesman. You can figure out for yourself whether you need coaching and what value coaching might have from what I'm saying. But let me tell you and explain what difference it makes for us. And I've said this before, kind of explaining what we're trying to do. The example I use is a guy called Rich Hall. Rich Hall was a New Zealander. And if you look at a graph of people who climbed Mount Everest, it was summited first by a Brit in 1953, I think the year was. But if you look at the graph of how many people summited, over the next 30 years, only a tiny trickle of the world's greatest climbers then managed to do the same and summit Everest. But in the mid-1980s, Rich Hall realized this mountain actually isn't intrinsically difficult. If we build a support structure, things like base camp and make sure there's oxygen and there's a program for climatization, if we do this around people, we can take people relatively safely up and down this mountain who are just really good climbers. And so it's down to people like Rich Hall that the reason that you see that kind of line going up Everest every summer now. Well, we think the same thing about church planters. I mean, there are some guys who are out there who are just, for some reason, they're the whole package, but most aren't. And we need to figure, how do we put the right resources around people, not so that we eliminate the risk, but just give people the best chance of being able to thrive. But here's the thing I noticed, having been around things for a few years, even with the guys who instinctively just know how to do ministry and have seen some success, how many of those guys actually a few years down the line in ministry end up in real spiritual unhealth, either lost to sins of seduction of money, sex or power, or bullying, or something else. And here's some frightening statistics that I've come across. In the UK, the average guy leaves ministry, the average age that a guy leaves ministry is 45. Roughly, that's 15 years into full-time ministry, and there's a glut of men leaving ministry at that age. And we've got to ask the question, why? And I think the answer is because guys that kind of age are old enough to realize that they're not going to be the next young thing. There's a lot of shattered aspirations and dreams. But very often guys that kind of age are burned out because they've spent the last 15 years pouring their lives into something. And they've burned high on output, but have burned very low on input. And now there's no way of coping with the realization that he's dealing with many of his mistakes as well as his successes. So the church he's been building, normally as a sole pastor with a tiny staff team, is now unavoidably a reflection of his weaknesses as well as his strengths. And for many guys, that just becomes unbearable as they begin to realize, well, I'm the blockage. Now, what do? Well, obviously, guys like that, they need Christ. But very often at that point, 15 years in, they are probably habitually unable to apply the gospel to their own heart with a freshness and a joy and a delight. And so the only way they can see forward is to escape ministry. I think that is some kind of like, it's a medevac off the mountain. Whereas I feel like I'm Rich Hall saying to people at the start, why don't we give these guys an oxygen mask? You know, just breathe deeply the life of the gospel into your ministry. And that's what we're trying to do in coaching and in the church planting training we're providing, to say, we're going to provide some things around you so that you grow in health and receive plenty of input from the start. So what does gospel coaching, what difference does gospel coaching make? And I've got a number of things, 5 things here that I think the difference gospel coaching makes. The first thing is that gospel coaching is important because the issues that we face, many of us in ministry, but not just in ministry, or not just in full-time ministry at least, many of the challenges we face are really, really complex. So I remember my first years in ministry, where our church plant is, we're a left-wing, artsy, rundown, messy part of the city. I remember advising a guy in his 60s who was cross-dressing, never told his wife. I had another lady who was, I think, genuinely being tormented by evil spirits in some way. I had another lady who was, she had Tourette's and she would shout profanities through the sermon. I had another guy who would write offensive letters to me, to local politicians, pretending to be me, so using church-headed notepaper. I had another guy who would send photos of himself to other married men in the church. I had capable people who we were trying to train and release into ministry. In those first 4 years, the 2 other elders who were alongside me left the church for very good reasons, on very good terms, but I was left alone. And that meant that I think I got very close to quitting a number of times, in part just because the job is immensely, unbelievably messy. I went in thinking my job essentially is to teach the Bible, do evangelism and pray. I mean, that's roughly what I'm called to do. And yet here I am running a building project, managing a staff team, leading a church through constant change, doing endless conflict management with people. And the level of complexity of the things that we're facing pastorally is massive. And here's the thing, there isn't a course I can do that will ever skill me up enough. So how do I begin to break down those very complex problems and sort of start to work through them? And into that, I think coaching helps. It's an effective tool for dealing with complexity. That's the first thing. The second thing, I just think learning isn't linear. And very often in coming up with solutions to problems we face, we are perpetually innovating solutions. And again, in the city where I am, I can't just pick up a course that's been designed in another part of the world or even in another part of the UK. Very often there are all sorts of reasons why we end up adapting and contextualizing and reshaping things. And that has to do with, or the thing it requires is a level of professional development that comes through reflective practice. So because we can't just take tools always off the shelf, instead we've got to take tools, think deeply, steal some of the great ideas, try some things, review, reflect, and rebuild something better. And I think that's very difficult. Again, it comes down to complexity, but how do we begin to work through some of these things? I think churches in the UK, one of my reflections is that we are terrible at professional development for church ministers. So typically a church might support the pastor to do another qualification, another degree or a doctorate. But again, the kind of expertise that I need a lot of the time is not just that kind of academic involvement. It involves observation, critical reflection, and creative solutions. And that's where I think, again, coaching comes in, because the core competencies for church planters that I see that we know are make or break are not things that you grow through attendance at a conference. They're around character and skill formation. You don't acquire emotional resilience or emotional intelligence at a conference generally. So there's something around how we learn and how we grow that is significant that gospel coaching helps with. Thirdly, and I think this is a case for gospel coaching particularly, is around proper diagnosis of the problems that we're facing. The journey that many guys are making, I've sort of alluded to already, is the realization that they are the problem in ministry. So if you saw my video that I made for this seminar, I made two, but there was one involving the box. If you've seen it, you'll know what I'm referring to. And again, the question I asked is what's in the box? And the things in the box are the things that prevent growth, and they are personal and they are hidden. And yet all the time in ministry, I am leading out of my own spiritual depth. And so the things that I don't want to look at, the things I want to avoid is my own spiritual shallowness and the things that create spiritual shallowness. And if there's no depth because things I'm trying to hide, a sin, a lack of joy, a lack of boldness, a coldness to Christ, those deep-rooted fears or deeply held idols. In my culture, it's very common to identify all the reasons why I might be the victim, and it's very attractive to perceive oneself to be the victim in the story. I meet church planters all the time who say, well, if only I had this thing, that thing, I would be successful. I think the older, though, that I get as a leader, the more I realize, no, I am the problem. I am carrying around sins and ways of thinking and ways of functioning that are not spiritually healthy, but I daren't admit that to anyone. That's why they're in the box, at least not in a deep way. I daren't talk about them. I might mention them in a superficial way, but I don't want to expose my heart to say to someone else, this is what I really think. This is what I really feel. This is where I need you to apply the gospel to me afresh because I'm unhealthy here. And instead, to get there, it requires, I think, an openness and a vulnerability that isn't easy to come by. But I think we don't go there because we don't perceive that to be our problem. You might have come across that phrase, to the kid holding a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. I think we've seen that in our household literally at times. But what that phrase communicates is that you start with the solutions that you're currently holding. And I wonder whether for most of us, we behave like the biggest problem I face, at least in ministry, is simply lack of knowledge, because that's comforting to me to think that I'm incapable or incompetent only because it's a knowledge issue. So I go to training sessions to acquire knowledge. But the reality is that most of the challenges I face are not issues of knowledge, they're issues of motivation or issues of skill or issues of even satanic activity. And through actual gospel coaching conversations, all of those things are laid bare. I remember one of our leaders who was just confessing a lack of evangelistic zeal in the church that he was planting. And his solution was basically to beat the church up over it. And he couldn't see how that might end up having the opposite effect to what he wanted. But through the coaching session, I was drawing out from him, helping him to see maybe actually there's a lack of warmth to Christ, a lack of reliance on Christ, leading to a whole culture in the church where there was just no zeal for mission, because there was no sense that they had a Christ worth celebrating. And that was coming out in his preaching, it was coming out in his manner of leadership, because it was coming out of where he was spiritually. Now, it took quite a long time to get there with him, but through that, we're able to break that down and expose it for what it is. Now, fourthly, moving on from that, I think the solutions that we need to explore in coaching are found through the gospel. So in coaching, in gospel coaching, we often talk about doing a gospel dance, which is basically where we're helping a guy see the reality of his sin for what it really is. And as he's broken by that, I then get to minister the gospel to him. So one of the guys I was coaching was just confessing his own laziness, and he just felt crippled by fear. He was a few months away from launching the church plant, and he thought, I'm just waking up in the morning and I'm lacking motivation. I don't know what to do, and just feeling crippled by unable to move. And he thought the gospel coaching conversation that we were about to have was going to be a strategy to get organized, plan well, eat a good breakfast. Because I think he essentially still thought that the solution was probably just more law. But as we talked, he saw the depth of the problem was greater than that. It was to do with his fears. It was to do with, it had its roots in idolatry. There was fear of failure. There was a lack of dependence on Christ. And the issue that he was trying to avoid was actually much bigger than he thought it was. But then, having worked it through the gospel and asked a number of questions, what Jesus makes of this and what's the path to health, and then putting together an action plan that included dependence on Christ. So it wasn't just kind of do exercise and eat your meals and that sort of thing. But through applying the gospel, he started to move towards health. And he isn't just more healthy in that one area, but it actually enables him to face his self-doubt and failure and insecurity in other areas. And that enables him to be a better leader across the board. And then fifthly, I think it's worth just mentioning that I think coaching helps because it helps us work through, particularly in areas of failure and brokenness, as well as success. So how do we help a church planter whose church plant has failed to then process that grief or the resentment around that or the anger around that? No one in seminary ever taught us how to lament the death of the church that we've planted. Okay, that's never appeared on the module list. So again, coaching, it might sound in that case a little like counseling and different things. So I don't think it is, but it's a set of tools to help us navigate this together that enables us to process things and disciple people through that. So let me ask the next question, which is what are we doing in a gospel coaching session? What is it that you're doing in coaching? Well, most sessions run for around 90 minutes. And they follow typically the same format. We never really meet less than once a month. We meet sometimes more often than that. And there are 5 components really, all around the CROSS acronym. So C first for CROSS. We connect, we talk about family. I share a little bit, he shares a little bit, we talk, and it's covering ground of that relational, personal, missional, spiritual things. How are we doing? And what's been the flow of things going on in life at the moment? And then we move on to the next letter in the CROSS acronym, to R, which is review. And I, as a coach, have my notes from the last coaching time. Sometimes we've agreed on a project or a conversation or next steps. If the guy doesn't do what he says he's going to do, well, that's a problem. So I'm there to hold him to some account. And often then we reflect on how that went, and there's additional learning process. So it's not just checking he's done what he said he's going to do, but it's also reflecting on what's been learned through that process. And then we move on to the next stage, the third phase, which is talking around the issues that he wants to talk through. Sometimes it's one thing, sometimes it's a small number of things. And in that, I will try and ask a whole set of questions to draw out from him, what's the objective? What are we driving towards? Where do we need to get to? So that's the O of cross, objective. And again, it's around some of those things of relational. It might be an issue with marriage or his children or personal conflict. It may be something personal. It may just be that he's unfit or demotivated or doubting his sense of calling. It may be something missional. There's a strategy, there's a process, or there's some kind of decision making that he's trying to work through, some kind of leadership call he's trying to make. Or it may be spiritual, some sin or a lack of joy, or something that's going on in the congregation that he wants to address. And so then we move into and this is really fairly deep into the conversation, we get to a point of developing a strategy to move forward. So that's the first S of cross. And it's here where we start to have those deep conversations about the gospel. How does Christ then minister to you in this? How can you remind yourself of the gospel when you're in this fight over your motivation or the challenge over this relationship? And sometimes it might be more skill-based. It can be what's the program or what's the plan going forward, but it's rarely just that. And then we get to the final step, which is supplication. It's prayer. We take it to the Lord and say, Jesus, we love you, we need you, and we invite Christ to bring health and growth into the situation. And very often I'll invite the coachee to pray so that the prayer isn't just a means of me finishing or blessing the conversation at the end, but that we are intentionally bringing the things that we've been talking through in a very clear, intentional way to Christ and inviting him and asking for him and depending on him in all of that. So that's what we're doing in coaching. That's what it looks like. There's five steps. But then that sort of brings us full circle to then this question of, well, does everyone need a coach? And I'm very conscious that I've been talking about church planting because that's my context. That's the context in which I coach all the time. However, I do know this, at our church, we would love to get to the point where more folks are being coached and offering themselves to be trained as coaches. We'd love to be in a situation where every member of church staff has a coach. We'd love for them to be coached by people in the church congregation. And eventually maybe to get to a point where everybody who's leading ministry areas is being coached to solve some of the problems they're facing. But what I do know is that we need to build into our culture, if it isn't there, if not in a formal coaching way, at least the aspiration of these kind of coaching conversations, that is deep conversations with people we trust to present Christ into the areas of our lives that we find most hard to talk about, or the things that we dread coming up. Those focused, personal discussion around our relational, personal, missional, and spiritual lives. And I don't know what the challenge is that you face in Chattanooga with that. I do know, I was chatting to an American friend of mine. He made a very sweeping generalization, but he was an American. He's allowed to make it. But he said of this, he lives in Britain now, but he lives in the north of our city. And he said, here's my observation. You Brits, you're like coconuts. You're basically impossible to get to know. There's a lot of shell. You know, we hide our emotions. We have secrets from everyone. But he said, I have noticed this. When you do manage to crack inside, then it is authentic and nothing is hidden. It's real, and you get to know the person, and there's an honesty and an openness that is deep and authentic. But then he went on to say, in my experience, Americans are like peaches. On the outside, generous, high openness, but very often there's a core, there's something held back and hidden, the secrets are deep. And if that's the case, I think we just need to develop ways of having conversations where our motives and our idols are laid bare, and invite somebody to come in and figure out with us, how do we apply the gospel to the darkest recesses of our soul? because we know that the power of God, the Holy Spirit, is so able to do his ministry into those places and bring transformation in life. And when he brings life there, it does offer real transformation and change, and very often not just in that area, but in a number of areas of life at the same time. Sandy, I'm going to finish there, and I'm going to hand back to you, but I'm available for Q&A.
Wow, Andy. Yes, let me see. We do have a question here. All right, someone asked, what are the distinctions between coaching and discipling?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And I think very often it depends how we frame discipling. So, and I think that can be quite a difficult thing to define, because some of that's culturally determined in terms of what we imagine discipling to be. But I do know that very often we talk about discipling relationships as an intentional one-on-one conversation. But very often that intentional conversation may be around a study of the scriptures. It may be around discipling somebody into a specific role or ministry area. And I think the coaching conversation is a little more open-ended. It's a little bit more around starting where someone may be at and saying, what are the challenges that you're facing? And then I think that the main tool in the coach's toolbox is around just asking incisive questions. So there is some dependence on or a desire to see the individual himself be able to reflect on their own practices, their own heart, their own desires, and then starting to ask this question: what do you think Jesus makes of that? What would Jesus say into that? Are there any verses that you can think of that speak directly into that? And I think, therefore, that in a coaching relationship, one of the things I've noticed that's different to, say, a mentoring or discipling relationship, where I think it was a more constrained conversation, in that there was a tight flow to it, to say, well, we're meeting together with the intention of looking at this passage, and the aim at the end of it is to understand what the passage is saying and to have an involved conversation into how we're going to apply it. In coaching, it's slightly more open-ended, when we can be talking about all sorts of different things around skills and personal maturity and personal growth, and at times it will be effectively a discipling conversation. But not only is it open-ended, it's the agenda is really set by the individual themselves to say, well, these are the things that I'm battling with at the moment. But very often the trajectory that we go through is not where the coachee would expect to go, because they think the problem is a small thing. I've just noticed that I'm really weary at the moment, or I'm struggling with this or that. And then actually, as we begin to unpick just through asking careful questions, what they begin to see is that there's a bigger pattern going on, and it's their heart that's being exegeted. And we're trying to figure out how we apply the gospel into that. So it's a little bit more focused maybe on the individual and the leadership challenges they face. But I wouldn't want to make a strong distinction and say it's not discipling, but it doesn't look like some aspects of discipleship relationships and that sort of thing. So I wouldn't want to force a big wedge through it and say, well, it's definitely not discipling. I think it is, but it's related, but it's not precisely the same.
I have another question. Did this concept of coaching start? Where did that start? I kind of know a little bit about it, but explain to our folks the practice of coaching and where it's going on and the value of it.
Yeah, so I think, it's the idea is, as I try to say at the start, I think some of the ideas around coaching, the language of coaching, and some of the patterns of coaching has been around in the business world for a little while. But the notion of gospel coaching specifically is has been, and Sandy, you may know a little bit more about the origins of this in the States, but our interaction with this has been through having folks through the UK Partnership and partnerships with churches like yourselves, folks who've sent over trained coaches to come and train us, because we were aware that the challenges, you know, some of the things that I've been trying to explain, the challenges that we face are so complex, and we just don't know how to work those through with people. So as soon as we heard about coaching, we could immediately identify that it would be a tool that would be of immense value to us, because it's not been a pattern of our practice at all in any of the movements that we've been involved in the UK. So we could see from what folks were telling us and showing us from CMM in Atlanta, you know, and through Redeemer City to City as well, we could see that there would be huge advantages for us. But I think. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I remember a conversation we had at one point when you were saying that, yeah, the coaching really had to be contextualized. It was very difficult for American to coach a Brit on how to plant a church in the UK, because we don't know the culture, and that you have to make it your own. So there's an aspect of coaching there, isn't it?
Yeah, we're very keen to have contextualized coaching. It's interesting because the deeper the relationships go, the more it can work across continent. So I'm coached by an American at the moment, but I think that works because we've had a very dynamic relationship where he's worked very hard to understand my context, and I've worked hard, I think, to try and explain the context as well as I can. So and again, this maybe goes back to some of the stuff around discipling and particularly mentoring. A mentor is, you know, a mentoring relationship might be where you're following someone around. And, you know, I'm desperate as a church planter to someone to tell me what to do next. Just tell me what you did, what worked. And actually, that doesn't work because we're working in such contextualized environments where we do need to innovate our own solutions to things, where things are not the same, and we will end up making a whole different set of mistakes if we just try and copy and paste in a different setting. So we are looking to try and develop, you know, we've got 15 coaches trained in the UK now, but the plan is to have many, many more, so that we can really grow a movement of coaching in the UK.
Well, I think this is one of the beauties of these kind of global connect events, that we do begin to understand each other's cultures more, and we can be more helpful to each other and speak gospel truth to each other. But cultures are very different, and yeah, it can get very messy in that way as well. Someone just asked if you knew of any specific training to teach lay people how to coach.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, we don't at the moment, just because we haven't even trained enough coaches. Our vision for how things will work in the UK is that no church planter will come through one of our training programs without at least being offered a coach, although increasingly we expect it to be a requirement, because we think it's that vital to the health of the planter. Then from there, we're looking and thinking about how we train particularly women to be coaches as well, so that folks who, particularly for planters' wives, to be coached, with a vision long term to, as I say, seeing that trickle to staff, to ministry leaders, and then into the congregation. And I know that CMM, who've been training us as coaches, they have done some training for churches, not about how to turn everybody in the congregation either into a coach or receiving coach, or receiving coaching, but how to develop what they would talk about as intentional conversations, which is really the same thing, but it's baking it into the culture of a church. They've done some work on that, but they are way ahead of where we are at the moment. And as I say, our first intention is to get this delivered so that anybody who's planting a church in the UK is receiving coaching.
But your wife has been invaluable to you, hasn't she, in assessing couples, and she's really become a part of this whole process too with you, hasn't she?
Yes. So we're just again, I think slightly through our story, but I think through what we experienced, planting is such a lonely experience. And there were so few people, 15 years ago, there were so few people who were planting churches at that point in the UK. We sort of scraped around to get expertise where we could, but we didn't. We were relying so much on sort of secondhand conversations with people about how things work, and it led to feelings of we felt isolated and different things. I think we were very conscious that we wanted to be, and we've said it a number of times, we want to be amongst the last of a generation who just had to face that and felt the pain and the difficulty of that. That if there are things that we can put in place that mean that we are taking responsibility to say this stops with us, that folks coming into this, we don't invite them to be partners in planting without properly training and resourcing, with coaching being a core component of that. That can't be allowed to just carry on as it has, because people get hurt. One of our church plants has just failed this last Sunday on Easter Sunday, and I think it would be a lot more difficult for the couple at the center of that if they were not receiving support and help from a number of us who are helping to see them through with that. But this is a hard and painful ministry, and we shouldn't be expecting people to do it alone. And the burden it places on husbands and wives just to be the primary source of support. I mean, someone's posted about Proverbs 20 verse 5, and it is in the Q&A that the purpose of a person's heart are deep waters, but the one who has insight draws them out. And I think when planters feel alone, the person they then end up relying on is their wife, and she ends up bearing a burden of trying to spiritually rejuvenate her husband. And again, it's not that that's wholly inappropriate, but it's simply if that's an additional burden that we're applying onto marriages, we're sort of inviting Satan to come in and say, we'll apply pressure in the marriage as well. So I think as Joe's worked with some of the women in the city who are maybe newer to church planting, we just realized that there's a role for us and for her, and with other also experienced pastors' wives, to resource and support women going through that. I think it is peculiar that in some of the things that our wives have had to deal with as we've been planting very often have been just navigating the ambiguity of relationships, what expectation placed on her, and also what role does our home play, particularly in the early days of church planting, and some of the difficulties of that. Navigating that is very difficult. Financially, the strain that can come in on marriages as well in the early days of planting, when the church has not got much resource. Again, it places all kinds of pressures on the family unit. So again, having experienced folks outside the situation, but local enough that they're a drive away, can again just relieve some of that burden in a very real way. That goes beyond just, you understand my experience, but we can help walk through a little bit and unpick where are the real challenges and battles here, and how do we begin to bring the ministry of the Spirit into this and grow resilience and health into this. So yeah, I'm a great believer that this is more than just about developing some skills.
Mm-hmm. Well, Andy, this has really been great. A lot of food for thought. Let me pray for you right now. Dear Lord, I just thank you for Andy. I thank you for how you've worked in his life. I thank you for Joe. I thank you for this couple, how they minister to others, how they make a real difference in others' lives, Lord. And we'll meet them where they are. We'll love them. We'll care for them. We'll coach them, Lord. And thank you, Lord, that you want us all to be open ourselves totally to you and to others, and to be all about the gospel, but yet you want the gospel to penetrate our lives and be the people that we should be and that we can be, so that we may serve you and honor you on this earth, dear Lord. Life is messy. Being involved with others is messy. But Lord, help us to take these risks and the time to be what we need to be, be the gospel to others, Lord. And thank you for the example of Andy and others. And as this ministry of coaching develops in the UK, across Europe, and among the Christian community in the world, Lord, that you would bless this and encourage all of us. We all do need a coach to keep us going, to address the deep issues of our lives, Lord. And I pray for Andy in his role as pastor at Grace Churchdale Road there. I know that it's been a difficult year for the church. They've lost folks to the virus, Lord, and it's been really hard for a young church. I pray for Jo and her work there in Birmingham and her service with the church and through Paracleo. And thank you, Lord, for bringing this couple together. And we thank you for Fionn and Josh. They're really cute little kids, Lord, and the Barney, that's who you added to their church to bring joy and love. And I thank you for this UK partnership that our church is involved with, Lord, that I just feel like we learn so much from our partners there in the UK. And I know that we are genuine partners. We love each other. We are friends, and we really care for each other. And I thank you for the opportunity that we have as a church to connect with mission partners, not only in the UK, but around the world, Lord, for your sake and for your honor and glory. And I would ask that you would continue to bless this relationship. Thank you, God, for tonight, for this time together. Thank you again for Andy. And we're just really grateful for him and for him being one of our church planters. And we thank you for how you use him there, not only in his church, but with the church planters, and how difficult it is to plant a church anywhere these days. But God, we know that you call us to serve you, and faithful is he who calls us, and he will do it. Thank you, dear Lord. And we thank you so much for our time together this evening. And I pray in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks so much, Andy. Hey, we're going to see you here in person, aren't we, in October?
I really hope so. We're planning on that. So I'm really looking forward to it.
We are looking forward to it. I'm sure that folks here with us tonight will be looking to meet you in person. So I'm going to say goodnight to you. Get to bed, get some sleep. Thanks again for staying up late for us. And we will see you soon. Thanks, buddy. Good night. Bye-bye. And for you out there, I would just like to say thank you so much for connecting with us tonight, being with us with Andy. If you would like to connect with Andy directly, we have some contact information that we can show you. Here's the family. There's Joe, Fionn, and Josh there, the Weatherley family. And if you would like to email Andy, there you have some information and his different social media accounts. Feel free to contact him. And also, if you'd like to learn more about the UK Partnership, there's a couple of websites you can go to that you can check out the different churches in the states that are involved in this partnership, and also the churches in the UK that are involved. It's a great ministry, and we're really grateful. Ed Norton, a pastor at Independent Pres in Memphis, is the coordinator of the UK Partnership. Well, there we have it, another global event. Next, we will be meeting in June. Amjad will be sharing with us about East meets West, the challenges Muslims face coming to Christ in a Western context. That should be very, very interesting. So thanks again for being with us tonight. We'll see you next month. And from First Pres Chattanooga, good evening. Bye-bye.